Hey everyone, welcome back to Genshin What If, the series that talks about what could be in Genshin. I'll be continuing the Signature Weapon series, and today's lucky stars are going to be Heizou, Collei, and Beidou. If you haven't watched the past episodes, I highly recommend doing so. And as always, here's my disclaimer. I'm not a theory crafting master, so I might get a few things wrong. Additionally, the point of these weapons is to make something that will synergize with the intended character, not necessarily make something that's a guaranteed best in slot. If you have any critiques, feel free to comment below. Just remain respectful. I'll also drop some of my personal rules when it comes to making weapon concepts. These exist either for balancing or simplicity purposes. Take a moment to pause if you need to, and without further ado, let's jump right in.
I'm feeling alright today. I'll take the chance to try to get some more done than usual.
First up on the list is Collei. Admittedly, I had a hard time figuring out a weapon passive for her due to the fact that she doesn't have a kit with specific niches. Her skill and burst don't have the highest damage, but in some teams her Dendro application can be used for a few reaction-based teams. As such, I decided to focus on her abilities as a reaction-based support. Her signature weapon, Avidya Archer, has a base attack of 510 and an energy recharge stat of 45.9. The passive, Seeds the Sprout, provides a team with the Verdant Rush effect after the user triggers a reaction. If the damage type matches the user's element, Verdant Rush increases talent damage by 15 to 30%, and transformative reaction damage by 10 to 20%. The effect lasts for 10 seconds and can occur off-field. I'm going to assume that everyone knows all the transformative reactions, so I won't list them all, but to clarify talent damage, it basically covers all the aspects of a character's kit. Autos, skills, bursts, and passives. In this concept, the goal is to have characters who trigger frequent reactions in order to maintain the buff uptime. Since the effect is a team-wide buff, it helps to put this on support units like Collei, so the main damage dealers can have a weapon that supports their offensive abilities. With this concept focusing on Collei, I'll be showing you two team examples on how this weapon buffs her teams. Starting with talent damage, this is something spread teams can benefit from. This is a team that will have very high uptime, since Collei can deal consistent spread. In addition to buffing her own damage, pairing her with a spread DPS like Tighnari would allow him to also make use of the 30% damage bonus. The other team is the Bloom teams and all of its variants. While not as consistent, Collei can create some Dendro cores with Bloom and proc the effect. Since Dendro cores are considered to be Dendro damage, they will gain the damage bonus. And just to make it clear, this passive is a multiplicative bonus, not an additive one like how Kave's burst has. So let's say a core from Bloom, Virgin, or Hyper Bloom dealt 20,000 damage. A 20% bonus means the damage becomes 24,000. Then of course, take into account enemy defense and resistance. Team comp, especially in a Bloom team, is very important when determining whether Collei's weapon will be able to maintain uptime. If Dendro is the main aura in a rotation, then that means Hydra will be the trigger, and as such, Collei may not be able to proc the effects properly. But even if you're in a team where Collei is mainly an applicator, you can take a gamble and hope she'll randomly trigger at least one reaction when you use her skill or burst. Other characters who want this bow generally want to support teammates that deal the same kind of elemental damage. For characters that mainly just want the ER substat, I chose Amber, Sara, Yelan, and Venti. Amber and Sara have very low application, so it'll be hard to guarantee they trigger a reaction. Yelan is generally used as an applicator, so she might not make great use of the passive either. And even though Venti is a swirl master, he won't be able to provide this bonus to other teammates unless you have a second animal unit as a main damage dealer, like Xiao or Wanderer. I'm sure there are teams where you can reliably have these four characters use the weapon properly, it just might not be as easy to pull off compared to the other characters on our list. For characters who only care about the passive, we have Fischl and Tighnari. In both of their respective teams, you can reliably proc the effects and provide your team with the damage bonuses. With that being said, energy recharge isn't as important on these two, so you might be better off slotting in a better weapon for them. Finally, we have characters who can use the substat and passive, Diona, Faruzan, and Goro. All of them are mainly characters who are able to support specific elemental niches. Diona can be a great option in a freeze comp, which buffs your main cryo DPS. Faruzan is an animal buffer, so triggering consistent swirls means your animal DPS has more damage. And this option has a slight niche, but having at least one other element in your Goro team means he can trigger crystallizes, allowing him to buff the geo damage of your team. That's all I got for Collei's weapon, let's move on to the next character.
Oh. It's all coming out now.
In my eyes, Heizou's meant to be this mix of an on-field driver and damage dealer. In a team like Taser or Aggravate, you can consistently swirl and trigger their respective reactions. But for personal damage, you would use his elemental skill. In order to have max damage on the skill, he needs to build up declension stacks. And luckily for him, his passive lets him get those stacks when he triggers a swirl reaction. Being a catalyst user means his autos are also able to swirl. There can be a lot of times where your whole rotation is set up and you have max stacks, but your skill is still on cooldown. And that's what I wanted to address with this concept. Heizou's weapon, Mysteries Unsolved, has a base attack of 510 and a crit rate bonus of 27.6%. The passive, Natural Insight, decreases elemental skill cooldown by 1 second, and gives a 5 to 10% elemental skill damage bonus when the user triggers a reaction. The damage bonus stacks up to 3 times, and will persist even if the user leaves the field. Stacks will only disappear when the user uses their skill, and the skill cooldown can only be reduced every 0.3 seconds. I basically saw a few videos of people using Heizou on Thundering Fury, which decreases skill cooldown upon triggering an electro reaction, but 2 issues came to mind. 1. Relying on Heizou to trigger a reaction different from its own element can be unreliable. For instance, in a single target situation, his swirls won't reapply Electro and Hydro onto a target, and as such, he can't trigger Electro Charge and get a cooldown reduction. The second issue is that you lose out on a Viridescent Venera set, which is a massive boost to your team's overall damage. So making this weapon, it was as simple as me going, let's make TF, but as a weapon. The weapon solves both of the issues I mentioned before. You can reliably get a skill cooldown reduction after triggering any reaction, not just Electro ones. And you can continue to use VV. The skill cooldown only being able to trigger once every 0.3 seconds is just so that you can't double proc the effect with an electrocharged or aggravated swirl. With this weapon, running an ADC build is generally better, since the whole purpose of the weapon is to deal more frequent skill damage. If you're looking to drive reactions, then I recommend picking an EM weapon. Compared to Solar Pearl, Heizou's Catalyst has a slightly lower skill damage bonus, but it balances out with the cooldown reduction. If seeing a high number is what you care about, then Solar Pearl is the pick, but for overall higher DPS and frequent skill usage, the concept is better. Characters that only care about the crit substat include Mona, Ningguang, Nahida, Wanderer, and Yai. Mona and Ningguang generally can't proc the effect as reliably, while Nahida and Wanderer don't have a need for a cooldown reduction. Nahida could use the 30% skill damage bonus, but there are still better weapons out there for her. In Yai's case, casting her skill 3 times means you lose any existing stacks each time you use the skill, but since the Totem Stone Snapshot, you can play her on field and regain those stacks for the 30% bonus. But if you're doing quick swap Yai, then this weapon is useless on her. For characters who can use the passive but don't want the substat, we have Beidou, Barbara, Kokomi, and Sucrose. All of them can reliably trigger reactions, meaning they can reduce the cooldowns of their skills, which are all pretty long. They don't really need the skill damage bonus though, and in the case of crit rate, none of them really want it either, especially Kokomi. For characters who can use the substat and passive, we have Collei, Lisa, and Yanfei. In the case of Collei and Yanfei, they can deal pyro reactions to reduce their skill cooldown and increase skill damage. For Lisa, pressing her skill is how you apply the conductive stacks, but it'll also erase your skill damage stacks. If you want to use the bonus, you need to trigger a few reactions before holding the skill. But even in the case that you ignore the skill damage, this weapon is great for reducing the cooldown. If you're running TF, you can theoretically cut 2 seconds off the clock for every reaction you trigger, but using this weapon also gives you room to run a completely different set, like Gilded Dreams or Thunder Soother. This is all for Heizou's weapon, so let's move on to the final character for the episode.
Cold beer after a hard day's work. Nothing like it.
When you take a look at Beidou's kit, you'll see it's very damage oriented. Hold her skill and take a couple hits, then you'll deal a huge hit of damage. Use her burst and deal even more damage over time. I wanted to make something that puts a focus on her parry and thought it would be cool to have it somehow buff her burst. Given how good she is in many team comps, I figured a good weapon was one that connected her skill and burst. Captain's Trophy is the weapon name, and it has a base attack of 565 with an attack percent substat of 27.6%. The passive, Down with the Ship, is the following. If any party member protected by a shield the user created gets hit, 50% of what would have been taken is added to an Amethyst bounty. The damage accumulated maxes out at 1500 to 3000 and can gain value even if off-field. When the user casts their burst, all the damage accumulated becomes a base damage bonus for every hit of their burst for 15 seconds. When the burst is cast, a new Amethyst bounty is created, which can immediately start collecting damage points again. The best way to picture this weapon passive is to look at it as how Ocean-Hued Clam works. Instead of collecting healing, it collects shield damage taken, and instead of doing a massive hit of burst damage, it takes that number and adds it to every single burst hit. As long as your character has a way of making a shield, then this weapon is a good option. It is very dependent on the enemies you fight, since some deal less damage overall and others could theoretically max out the bounty in one hit. Some attack faster, and some will attack very slowly. Despite that, this weapon is a perfect match for Beidou's kit. Her skill creates a temporary shield, at which she can block and parry attacks. Being able to block a few attacks with the shield stacks up damage for her burst. It provides a nice way to connect her two abilities together, and every time you block an attack, you'll have the satisfaction of knowing that it directly improves her burst damage as a result. This weapon is a good concept at base kit, but it gets even better at C1. At C1, Beidou's burst will create a shield, which can also go towards increasing the bounty's pool. Finally, since Beidou's burst is one that hits numerous times, she gains more value from the passive as opposed to a character whose burst only hits once. I used an emblem set when comparing her damage numbers between an attack and ER Sans. You can see the numbers are relatively similar, so the Sans is dependent on your substats. Characters that can make use of the attack percent stat are Chongyun, Diluc, Dea, Eula, and Razor. The character that only cares about the passive is Noelle. While she's someone who can use her shield to build up the bounty points and increase burst damage, it should be noted that when you cast her burst, only the first 2 hits are considered to be burst damage. The rest of her hits are buffed auto attacks, so the passive isn't even that good on her, but it is usable. Also, as someone who puts more value in defense, the attack substat is only a minimal increase. Finally, for a character that can make use of the substat and passive, we have Xinyan. Having attack scaling for her damage means that she can use a substat. Additionally, she can create a shield that can build up bounty points, but other weapons may still be better since her burst only hits a couple times, similarly to Noelle, so you may not get as much value out of it. That's all for today's episode. If you enjoyed the video, consider leaving a like and subscribing to support the channel. If there's a specific grouping or character you want me to cover next, or you have alternative ideas for weapons, let me know in the comments. I'll see you all next time. Bye!